I want to start off with the wrong theory of the emotions. And the wrong theory of the emotions is beautifully illustrated in a television and movie series, Star Trek. In this alternative fantasy world, there are characters, Mr. Spock in the original Star Trek, Data in one of the spin-offs, who are described as competent, capable, in fact, many ways, super competent and super capable people, but they're described as not having emotions. Spock is described as not having emotions because he's half Vulcan from a planet where they lack emotions. Data is an android who is said to lack an emotion chip. This lack of emotions on a TV series does not hurt them much. They're able to fully function. And in fact, in a TV series, emotions are often seen as a detriment. You do better off without them. And there are many people in sort of common sense might think, gee, if only I could just use my rationality, think reasonably and rationally, and not let my emotions guide my behavior, I'd be much better off. It turns out that this is a notion of how to think about the emotions that is deeply wrong, and in fact makes no sense at all. Using the example of Star Trek, Steven Pinker, in his book How the Mind Works, nicely illustrates the problem here. He writes, Spock must have been driven by some motives or goals. Something must have led him to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new civilizations, and to boldly go where no man had gone before. Presumably, it was intellectual curiosity that set him to drive and solve problems. It was solidarity with his allies that led him to be such a competent and brave officer. What would he have done if attacked by a predator or an invading Klingon? Did he do a handstand, solve the four-color map theorem? Presumably, a part of his brain quickly mobilized his faculties to scope out how to flee and how to take steps to avoid the vulnerable predicament in the future. That is, he had fear. Spock did not walk around naked around the ship. Presumably, he felt modesty. He got out of bed. Presumably, he had some ambitions and drives. He engaged in conversations. Presumably, he had some sociable interests. Without emotions to drive us, we would do nothing at all. And you could illustrate this scientifically. Creatures like Spock and Data don't exist in the real world. But there are unusual and unfortunate cases where people lose, to some extent or another, their emotions. And you could look at these people and see what happens to them. The classic case, the most famous case, is that of a man called Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage is the classic intro-psych example. Extremely poor guy, poor schnook. In 1848, he was a construction foreman. In 1848, he was working at a site with explosives and iron rods. And due to an explosion, an iron rod passed through his head like so. Imagine that rod shooting upwards. It went under his eye and popped out the top of his head. It landed about 100 feet away, covered with blood and brains. The rod itself weighed 13 pounds. Amazingly, Gage was not killed. In fact, he was knocked unconscious only for a short period, and then he got up. And his friends surrounded him and asked, "Are you okay?" And then they took him to the hospital. On the way to the hospital, they stopped by a tavern. And he had a little pint of cider, drink, sat down, talked to people. And then he had an infection, had to have surgery. But when it was all said and done, he wasn't blind, he wasn't deaf, didn't lose language, didn't become aphasic, no paralysis, no retardation. In some sense, what happened was much worse. He lost his character. Here's a description at the time of what Gage was like. And this is from Damasio's excellent book, Descartes' Error. He used to be a really responsible guy, a family man, very reliable, very trustworthy. But after the accident, he was fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest profanity, manifesting but little deference for his fellows. impatient of restraint or advice, a child in his intellectual capacities and manifestations. He had the animal pleasures of a strong man. His foul language is so debased that women are advised not to stay long in his presence. And he couldn't hold a job. He lost his family, couldn't hold a job. He ended up in a circus. He was in a circus going around the country with his big iron rod, telling everybody the story as they surrounded and clapped. There are other cases like Phineas Gage, cases where people have had damage to that same part of the brain, parts of the frontal cortex. And what they've lost is they've basically lost a good part of their emotions. And what this means is they don't really care that much about things. They can't prioritize. Damasio tells a case of one of his patients who was under the pseudonym here of Elliot. And Elliot had a tumor in his frontal lobe, and the tumor had to be removed, and with it came a lot of Elliot's frontal lobe. And again, as a result of this, Elliot was not struck blind or deaf or retarded, and he didn't become the sort of profane character that Phineas Gage became. But he lost the ability to prioritize. He lost the ability to set goals. Damasio describes him here. At his job, at an activity, he would read and fully understand the significance of the material. He works in an office. But the problem was he was likely all of a sudden to turn from the task he had initiated to doing something else and spending an entire day doing that. He might spend an entire afternoon deliberating on which principle of categorization he should apply to files. Should it be the date or the size of the document, pertinence to the case, or another? He couldn't set his goals. He ended up not being able to keep a job, not being able to deal with people. And these are not men who have lost their emotions. There is no case around where you could have your emotions entirely blotted out. But they lost a large part of their emotional capacity. And as a result, their rationality failed. Emotions set goals and establish priorities. And without them, you wouldn't do anything. You couldn't do anything. Your desire to come to class, to study, to go out with friends, to read a book, to raise a family, to do anything, are priorities set by your emotions.